When you analyse a piece of text, think of it like you're putting it on trial because you need to interrogate it. To do that, just ask 3 basic questions. Firstly, what have they done? What have they written about? So, what's the meaning and the purpose of the text? How have they done it? So, what writing techniques have they used? And think of your figurative language techniques, which we'll go on to in a minute. And why did they do it? What effect were they hoping to achieve? So, what is the writer's intention? So, think how they want you to think and feel about what they've written. How do you respond personally to the text? Was the writer successful with that intention? Let's start with the first one of those questions. So, what is the explicit and implicit meaning of the text? Now, you should be able to work this part out quite easily thanks to your critical reading tools. But remember, this question is focused much more on how they've written the text rather than what they've written about. So we're looking at the core techniques that they've employed to convey the meaning rather than the meaning itself, but it's still good to know what that meaning is. You should revise your terminology so that you can speak eloquently and with authority on the writing techniques that the writers used. Now, there's some useful terminology coming up, and you don't need to know all of the terms, but if you aim to understand, say, 80% of them by the time you sit your exam, you should be well on your way to a top grade. If you don't already have a pen and paper to hand, it might be a good idea to pause the video here so that you can get them. Now, if there are any terms you don't know, then write the word down, and then afterwards put the term on a revision card with a brief definition next to it, then regularly test yourself on your new words until you remember them all. Allegory, alliteration, allusion, anachronism, anaphora, anthropomorphism, assonance, colloquialism, consonance, contrast, epistrophe, euphemism, hyperbole, idiom, imagery, incongruity, irony, juxtaposition, malapropism, metaphor, mood, onomatopoeia, oxymoron, paradox, personification, pun, pathetic fallacy, repetition, satire, sibilance, simile, symbolism, tone. Going back to our criminal trial analogy, think of all those techniques as pieces of evidence in a crime. How many has the writer committed in the text? Try and look out for those whenever you're reading and see how many you spot. And when you're asked in the exam to choose 3 examples, don't just write about the first 3 you see. Pick out the best ones, the ones that you know that you'll have more to write about when it comes to the effect. Also, don't set yourself an impossible task where you're scrambling to analyse the effect. If you pick out onomatopoeia, for example, of course write about the sounds that the writer wants you to hear, but also why those noises specifically. How do they link to the meaning? Also look out for when writers vary the length of their sentences. Good writing has varied sentence lengths. It's not just one long sentence after another. That would just be quite boring, if nothing else. So think about why they've chosen a short sentence after a few long ones, for example. Is it to emphasise a point, to shock the reader, to increase pace, for excitement or dramatic effect? If the writer has noticeably varied their sentence lengths, then comment on that as a technique and explain why you think that they did it. And for extra marks in the exam, specify the sentence type. So is it a simple sentence, a compound, a complex, or a compound complex, or a fragmented sentence even? It's worth brushing up on all of these when you're revising, as it might get you a couple of extra marks. So we've looked at the what and the how, we've figured out the purpose behind the writing and the techniques that the writers used. So why have they chosen those techniques? What effect do they want those techniques to have on the reader? As well as looking at the general mood and metaphors, zoom in on the text and look at individual words and phrases. And like their techniques, the writer's chosen those really carefully, usually because they're loaded with connotations, which again has a particular effect on the reader. A word's basic connotations are positive or negative. That's always a good place to start, but then be more specific about the effect. So does the writer want you to feel outraged or upset or amused? We need to learn how to interrogate language like that. So if the writer uses quite a powerful and impactful word, scrutinise it by cutting out the sentence and holding it up to the light on its own. What other meanings can you see there? Does it radiate a particular emotion? Do you think that the writer has consciously used those connotations to influence the reader somehow? Also think about the sounds of the words. If you've noticed that the writers use lots of consonants, for example, that makes the writing sound quite hard. Well, why have they chosen to do that? Do those repeated hard sounds create a sense of anger or aggression because the author wants to provoke and antagonise, perhaps? Whereas assonance makes the writing sound much softer, so does that create a soothing or gentle tone, perhaps to emphasise the sensitivity of the topic? The really important thing to remember when you're commenting on the effect of language is to ask yourself, do you really feel that? And it might sound like common sense, but so many students in the exam will write something they don't actually believe, but they think it's the right answer or it just sounds good. Make sure that the effect you're writing about is genuine. So if you spot a word that evokes sympathy, ask yourself if you actually feel sympathetic. Or if you're arguing a phrase encourages the reader to feel outrage, do you actually feel that feeling? And if so, great. Make sure that you explain why and where that outrage comes from. Either a memory or a personal experience of a topic, or just from a broad sense of injustice that you share, which you think that the writer is relying on. But if you're honest with yourself and your answer feels a bit contrived, then chances are the examiner will think so too. You'll get much higher marks when your answer rings true and sounds genuine. In summary then, be clear about the text's meaning and the writer's purpose, then look for language techniques that they've used, and then explain the effects that they have and what you think the writer's intention was. Also remember to revise your terminology, comment on sentence length and variation, critically analyse the connotations and the sounds of the individual words and phrases, and lastly, but really importantly, make sure your analysis is genuine. Don't write anything you don't really believe in, and stick to the emotions and feelings that really do resonate with you about the writing.